I'm here today to share some stories from my life in the hopes of illustrating that no matter what path you're put on, you can choose to promote peace. Before I begin, I feel the need to explain that my story is in no way a description of the vast majority of Muslim family life. Once we take the time to interact with one another, it doesn't take long to realize that for the most part, we all want the same things in life. A job with a decent wage, a safe environment for our children, and to live in a community that doesn't chastise us for our beliefs. However, in many religions, in many populations, you'll find a small group of people who hold so fervently to their beliefs that they feel they must use any means necessary to make others live as they do. Being raised in the home of a Muslim zealot, I've been exposed to many of the things Americans fear about Islam, and yet I stand here promoting peace. This would be impossible in a world where we hang on to those old prejudices. I'm here to dispel some of the stereotypes that some politicians and media pundits attempt to project into mainstream society. I feel that I can use these experiences to combat those who would take advantage of Americans' fears for their own ends. Because of political opportunists who use the radical elements of Islam to generalize the beliefs of all Muslims, but also because of men like Faisal Shahzad, who believes that the answer to American foreign policy is trying to detonate a car bomb in Times Square, I feel I must speak up to balance the scales. It's a foolish mistake to believe that religious extremism is exclusive to Islam. Unfortunately, there are endless examples in every belief system of religiously motivated violence. And if history is any indication, there will always be acts of terrorism perpetrated in the name of religion. But as a society that values the individual freedoms afforded to us in our Constitution, it's un-American to ostracize entire groups for the actions of a few. When we ostracize the innocent, it tears apart the fabric of our society, which only works to foment the next generation of intolerance. With that being said, I would like to illustrate the path that I was put on as a child by my father, who now resides in a maximum security prison. This was a special Friday for me. I was a normal 6-year-old staring at the chalkboard waiting for the 3 o'clock bell to ring so that I could escape from school. But that day my father was waiting in the hallway early. He said, "Salaam alaikum," which means peace be upon you. And I replied, "Wa alaikum salam," and peace be upon you, the proper way for two Muslims to greet one another. He tells me that we're going to the mosque for Friday prayer, where the blind Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman was to preach. You see, at midday every Friday, hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world file into mosques to listen to sermons given by sheikhs. The Quran, the sacred text of Islam, says that praying in a group brings you more blessings than praying alone, making Friday prayer the most blessed prayer of the week. Most clerics preach harmony between Muslims and non-Muslims, believing that there is a place in this world for all of its inhabitants to live in coexistence. Sheikh Abdurrahman was not one of those men. He sat at the front of the worshippers with a microphone attached to his collar, and he began his khutbah, or oration, and I sat trying my best to mimic my father as he listened intently to the Sheikh's words. That day the Sheikh argued that Western culture was corrupting Muslims all over the planet, that the consequences of American democracy were materialism, sexual perversion, and idolatry, meant to distract believers from the true word of God. He laid many of the Muslim world's ills on a lot of the same groups that Jerry Falwell blamed for 9/11, pagans, feminists, and gays. But the Sheikh saved his most venomous words for those of the Jewish faith. He spoke of interference and collusion by the United States and its Western allies to further their own agenda at the expense of Muslim nations. And he used the audience's anger at the state of Israel to foment their emotions. He also spoke of, at the time, it was the height of the Afghan War, and he spoke of how the American government had used the Afghan fighters, and that when they no longer were useful to them, they were discarded like trash on the roadside. When he finished his sermon, my father took my hand and he led me toward the front. This wasn't the first time that I'd met the sheikh. In fact, I'd spent more than a few nights either at the mosque or at one of my father's friends' houses, or even in our own living room, sitting on the floor listening to the sheikh and the other men discuss religion and politics. I realized that it was always somewhat ominous exchanging words with the sheikh after one of his sermons. It's looking back now that I realize even in a room full of people vying for his attention, his mind was somewhere else, probably still wrapped with the passion and anger he clearly conveyed in his speech. On the drive home that afternoon, I wondered to myself what made the sheikh and his followers so intensely devout. I asked my father, "When did you become such a good Muslim?" And he replied, "When I came to this country and saw everything that was wrong with it." And in that instant, I saw the same look on his face that I had seen earlier on the sheikh's. Our family dynamic began to change soon after. It was during that time, at the height of the Afghan war, that I was forced to say goodbye to one of my best friends. His stepfather took him and his siblings from their home in New Jersey to Pakistan to train and then eventually fight in Afghanistan. He was 10. Because of his inexperience, he was used to lob grenades at the enemy's occupying forces. And when he returned to America less than a year later, where there once stood a happy, vibrant child, now stood a solemn veteran of the Afghan war. His innocence taken from him by a war he had no business being a part of. This is what happens when we use violence as a resolution of conflict. In a back-and-forth effort to gain even the slightest strategic advantage against one's enemies, man has gone to lengths that seem inconceivable to those who are sheltered from the negative effects of war. But make no mistake, humanity has shown that it's willing to exploit almost any resource, even the lives of children, all in the name of one ideology or another. Each time we resort to war, whether as a means of resolving conflict or for spreading some notion of forced democracy, we guarantee an escalation and desensitization of violence in our culture. The summer after I turned 7, my grandfather came to visit our family from Egypt. Little did he know my father had brought him here with the intention of trying to convince him to take my family back to Egypt so that my father could go fight in the Afghan war. At the time, the United States was secretly funding the Mujahideen, the Muslim men and sometimes children who were going to Afghanistan from all over the world to fight the Soviets. My grandfather's response was, "Absolutely not. Your family is your responsibility. If you want to make jihad, stay here and take care of them." Now let's take that word jihad for example. If you were to ask the average person, what do you think jihad means? They might say that it's an act of terrorism or that it means holy war. But that is not the definition of jihad. In reality, jihad can be something as simple as providing for your family. It has a much more abstract meaning. It's only those who wish to generalize and the extremists that reduce the word to a destructive act. And in fact, the Prophet Muhammad specifically referred to jihad that precludes violence as the greater jihad. And it was with that lesson that I learned that jihad can be something as that it can basically just be striving to live a moral and virtuous life. My grandfather went back home thinking that he'd won the argument, but my father was left only frustrated and unwilling to find a nonviolent outlet for those frustrations. On November 5th, 1990, when I was 7 years old, my father assassinated a man. That man was Rabbi Meir Kahane, the leader of the Jewish Defense League. The JDL, as it was called, was described by the federal government as the largest terrorist organization operating inside the United States at the time. Shortly before the assassination, Kahane had given a speech advocating for the violent removal of Palestinians from Israeli-occupied land. And while attempting to flee the scene, my father was also shot by a federal postal officer. Both he and Meir Kahane were rushed to the hospital with similar gunshot wounds. Excuse me. Kahane died at Bellevue Hospital that night. My father lived. Although he was initially acquitted of the murder, while serving time on assault and weapons charges, he began planning attacks on a dozen New York City landmarks, including tunnels, synagogues, and United Nations headquarters. Thankfully, those plans were foiled by an FBI informant. Sadly, the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center was not. My father, El-Sayed Nosair, would eventually be convicted for his involvement in the plot. A few months prior to his arrest, he sat me down and explained that for the past few weekends, he and some friends had been going to a shooting range for target practice. And he explained that I'd be going with him the next morning. And to be honest, I was so excited that I could barely sleep that night. My excitement once again began to mount the next morning when we got into the car. We arrived at Calverton Shooting Range, which, unbeknownst to our group, was being surveilled by the FBI. We walked towards a group of men huddled by the trunk of a car, and inside were a range of weapons. When it was my turn to shoot, my father explained how to hold the rifle to my shoulder and how to aim at the target about 30 yards off. I was so excited my palms were sweating. I gently squeezed the trigger, and my ears rang, and the noise echoed through the woods that surrounded the range, and a small notch showed where the bullet had broken through the canvas. Hearing the praise from the men around me, and with my father looking over my shoulder smiling, it was my proudest moment. He seemed to be having almost as much fun as I was, if not more. Using a fully automatic weapon, he shot the legs out from under one of the larger targets, causing it to come crashing to the ground. And the men all shouted and had a laugh. But by late morning, it began to softly drizzle, and I knew our time at the range was probably coming to an end. So, on what I figured would be my last turn, I took aim at the target and let each bullet fly. The last one hit the small orange light that sat on top of the target, and to everyone's surprise, especially mine, the target burst into flames. And as I watched the black smoke mix into the gray sky, my uncle turned to the other men and in Arabic said, "Ibn Abu," like father, like son. They all seemed to get a really big laugh out of that comment, but it wasn't until a few years later that I fully understood what they thought was so funny. They thought they saw in me the same destruction that my father was capable of. Those men would eventually be convicted of placing a van filled with 1,500 pounds of explosives into the sub-level parking lot of the World Trade Center's North Tower, causing an explosion that killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 others. These were the men I looked up to. These were the men that I called Ambu, which means uncle. It saddens me to think that had they not committed this crime, the innocent victims killed in the attack would be at home, spending time with their families. Instead, their loved ones are forced to live their lives without their guidance and companionship. I was 7 years old when my father went to prison. There's not a day that goes by that I don't wish he had chosen a peaceful life with his family. Instead, he exposed me from a very young age to the intolerance and radical nature of extremism. And yet I stand before you all today with this simple message, that no matter the level of violence you've been exposed to, it doesn't have to define your character. That in all of us is the ability to change our paths. I spent years of my young life visiting him in different prisons, Rikers Island, the federal prison in Manhattan, and even entire family weekends inside Attica State Penitentiary. I remember my first trip like it was yesterday. It was a dull gray morning. We got up extra early to make the trip into New York City. We climbed into our old wood-paneled station wagon and started off. I remember my nervousness as we entered the Rikers Island parking lot. A light mist seemed to cut us off from the rest of the world. Because my father had been in the hospital recuperating from his wounds, it had been several weeks since I'd last seen him. And it was obvious even to a 7-year-old that this was probably going to be a strange day. A bus took us across the bridge to the main facility where we were frisked for any prohibited items. And we were taken down a long hallway lined with cells that provided privacy for families visiting inmates. And as the guard opened the door, I saw my father sitting in an orange jumpsuit on a plastic chair. And he stood up and he smiled, and he took his time giving me a hug. And we sat down across from each other at the table. The first thing that I noticed was the long surgical scar that ran across his chest and up his neck, where the doctors had tried to remove the bullet that was lodged inside him. I remember trying not to stare at it. And while he and my mother sat in conversation, I wondered how his being in prison would affect our family. That first trip was nerve-wracking, but as the weeks turned into months, It became routine to have to pass through armed guards and barbed fences in order to see my father. This went on for years, but eventually my mother remarried, and we decided as a family to discontinue any further contact with my father. We also changed our names so as to hide our identity from the communities in which we lived. It's certainly unusual when an American citizen admits to being the son of the first member of Al-Qaeda to shed blood on American soil. Shame for what my father has done and fear for how I would be judged for his actions had caused me to hide my identity from most of those who know me, or knew me. I realized at a young age I had to be careful who I told my life story to. People's reactions have ranged from nervous laughter and shock to outright anger and threats against my life. I even once sustained a defensive wound as I tried grabbing a knife from the hand of someone I thought was a friend, as he lunged at me exclaiming, "I'd be doing this country a service if I killed you." Luckily, I was able to escape without any serious injury. By the time I turned 19, I had already moved 20 times in my life. That instability during my childhood didn't really provide an opportunity to make many friends. Each time I'd begin to feel comfortable around one or two people, it was time to pack up and move to the next town. And being the perpetual new kid at school, I was frequently the target of bullies. So for the most part, I spent my time at home, reading books and watching TV or playing video games. For those reasons, my social skills were lacking, to say the least. And growing up in a bigoted household, I wasn't prepared for the real world. I've been raised to judge people based on arbitrary measurements like a person's race or religion. One of the major turning points in my life came when I found a summer job at Busch Gardens, an amusement park in Florida. The exposure to so many different types of people was fundamental to the development of my character. I was able to contrast the stereotypes that I've been taught with real-life experience and interaction, and it didn't take long for me to realize the disservice that I was doing to myself and to those I was compelled to judge. Recognizing my own moral failings and being exposed to the outside world, I began to realize how little a person's religion or race or sexual orientation had to do with the formation of their character. I had a discussion with my mother about how my worldview was changing, and she said something to me that I will hold dear to my heart for as long as I live. She looked at me with the weary eyes of someone who'd experienced enough dogmatism to last a lifetime and said, "I'm tired of hating people." It was so simple, yet so profound for me that I often fight back tears just thinking about it. In these times of increased religious prejudice, I feel sharing my story helps bring greater context to the debate over religious intolerance. People can become frustrated when they think that one side cannot or will not understand their point of view. This is why I promote interfaith dialogue, because I believe it's the most useful tool for encouraging solidarity within our communities. And when I say dialogue, I don't mean that we pile everyone into a room to debate who's right and who's wrong. All I'm talking about is simple interaction, sharing a meal together, or working together on a community project. It not only aids in dispelling false stereotypes and prejudices, it helps to create stronger, safer communities. And opening up a dialogue between the different cultures and religions will help to promote mutual respect and understanding. Fortunately, we're now seeing a larger group of websites and literature that help illustrate how you can form or utilize your local newspapers, public officials, and religious institutions to help form a structured form of interfaith dialogue. And I really encourage everyone here to look into the different ways that they can involve their community. As Americans, it's our duty to protect the individual freedoms afforded to us in our Constitution. And as a society, we must work together in order to achieve those goals. Remember that extremism thrives on the fringes of society. When we divide people into smaller and smaller groups based on one arbitrary classification or another, we create communities ingrained with hostility toward one another. On Until recently, I chose not to come out with my story because I was ashamed for what my father had done. But today, most times you hear about Islam or the Middle East in the news, it usually refers to some form of extremist behavior. And I knew that I could use my experiences to combat those negative stereotypes. If I could show people that although I'd been subjected to this violent, intolerant ideology, that I didn't become fanaticized, that if I could choose to promote peace, anyone can. As I mature, I realize the only way that I can overcome the challenges of my past, which at times has been crippling, is to help others understand that hatred only produces more hate. But belief in nonviolence heals. Those cycles of violence, no matter how old, don't have to continue forever. I am not my father. And with that simple fact, I stand here as proof that violence is not inherent in one's religion or race, nor is it mandated that the son must follow the ways of his father. And should we fulfill our obligation to live peacefully and to put in the work needed in order to obtain peace, however difficult it may be, that ultimately we'll leave this earth a better place for the ones we love. Thank you.